The kid behind the counter picked the fishing rod up by the middle, bounced the tip twice like he was testing a car antenna, and leaned it against the side of the counter. "Yeah, old fishing rod. We get these. I can do $10 for the rod and the reel together." Earl Dunham stood on the other side of the counter. 80 years old, the faded red and black plaid Woolrich hunting cap his late wife Marion had given him for Christmas in 1986 pulled down over his ears because the Adirondack morning had teeth, the old bamboo fly rod with the small dark reel still mounted on it lying across the glass between them, and watched a 22-year-old in an Adirondack pawn polo look at the rig his father had fished with for 25 years and see $10 worth of old tackle. "That was my daddy's," Earl said, quiet. The kid, Sawyer by the crooked name tag, shrugged and tapped the reel with one fingernail, producing a small metallic ring. "Sure, 10 for the set. Final." Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The bamboo fly rod was a 1930s Montague, factory made, worth about $40 to a collector who liked wall hangers. But the reel mounted on it, a small, dark, heavy thing that looked like a piece of old machinery, was not a factory reel. It was a hand-built multiplying salmon reel made by Julius vom Hofe in approximately 1885 in the vom Hofe workshop on Fulton Street in New York City. The reel was German silver and hard rubber. The side plates were hand-engraved with floral scrollwork so fine that the lines were invisible unless you held a loop to them. The click mechanism, the small internal spring that made the reel sing when a fish ran, was a vom Hofe patented design that had not been manufactured since 1910. The reel was numbered on the foot, JVH 427. Julius vom Hofe and his brother Edward were the two greatest fishing reel makers in the history of American tackle. From the 1860s to the early 1900s, the vom Hofe workshop on Fulton Street supplied handmade reels to the Gilded Age sporting elite, the members of the great Adirondack fishing clubs, the salmon lords of the Restigouche and the Cascapedia, the men who fished with presidents and railroad barons. Every reel was made by hand. Every reel was numbered. Every reel was a precision instrument built to the tolerances of a Swiss watch. Earl's father, Lester Dunham, had bought the rod and reel together at a church rummage sale at the First Presbyterian in Saranac Lake in 1971 for $2. He had not known what the reel was. He had known it was well made. He had fished with it on the Saranac River, the Ausable, and the Raquette for 25 years, catching brook trout and landlocked salmon with a reel that had been designed to land Atlantic salmon on the rivers of New Brunswick for Gilded Age millionaires. Lester had died in 1996. The rod and reel had leaned against the wall in Earl's mudroom for 28 years. The reel alone was about to be appraised at $52,000. This is the story of how Earl Dunham walked into Adirondack Pawn on a Wednesday morning in April with $730 of trouble in his head, and walked out with the discovery that the old reel his father had bought for $2 at a church sale, the reel Lester had clamped to a factory rod and fished with in canvas waders on the Ausable every Saturday for a quarter century, had been made by the finest reel maker in American history in a workshop on Fulton Street for men who measured their wealth in railroads. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Earl. Earl Lester Dunham was born in 1944 in Saranac Lake, New York. His father, Lester Dunham, had been a caretaker, a North Country word for a man who maintained the private camps and lodges of the Adirondack wealthy. Lester had worked for 3 different families over 41 years, keeping the docks in, the roofs clear, the wood stoves stacked, and the boats turned over in the fall. It was seasonal work supplemented by winter logging and spring guiding. Lester had guided trout fishermen on the Ausable and the Saranac from 1955 to 1985, $20 a day plus lunch, no tips expected, none refused. Earl's mother, Marguerite, had cooked at the Hotel Saranac for 23 years. Earl went to Saranac Lake High, graduated in 1962, did 4 years in the Army, 2 at Fort Drum, which felt like home because it was 30 miles from Saranac Lake and just as cold, and 2 in Korea, came home and spent 36 years as a maintenance mechanic at the Trudeau Institute, the tuberculosis research facility on the hill above the lake. Married Marion Fleury in 1968. One son, Lester, named for Earl's father, now 54 and living in Plattsburgh, working for the State Department of Transportation. Marion had died in 2023 of emphysema. Slow. 3 years on oxygen. The tanks lined up in the living room like soldiers waiting for orders that never came. The well pump was the problem. The deep well submersible pump that drew water for the small house on Pine Street had failed in March. Motor burned out, 240 feet down. The well driller from Tupper Lake had quoted $730 for a new pump, pulled and installed. Without water, Earl was hauling jugs from the IGA and using the gas station restroom on Lake Flower Avenue. His Trudeau pension was $1,290 a month. Social Security added $2,080. After property taxes, which in Franklin County were modest but relentless, insurance, electric, propane, his blood pressure and arthritis medications, and groceries, he had about $80 of slack in a good month. He did not have $730. He could have called Lester Jr. in Plattsburgh. Lester Jr. was a highway maintenance foreman whose wife had gone back to nursing school at SUNY Plattsburgh at 49, and the tuition and the lost income were a weight they didn't discuss. Earl had not asked his son for $1 in 17 years. He was not going to start over a well pump. For 12 days, he hauled water. On the 13th morning, Wednesday, he went to the mudroom. The rod and reel leaned against the wall between a pair of snowshoes and a splitting maul, in the spot where Earl had put them after Lester's funeral in 1996. The rod was a 2-piece bamboo fly rod, maybe 8 feet assembled, with cork grip and nickel-silver ferrules. It had been a decent factory rod in 1935, and it was a tired factory rod now. The varnish was crazed, the wraps were frayed, the tip had been replaced at some point with a slightly mismatched piece of cane. The reel was still clamped to the reel seat. It was dark, almost black, which was the patina that German silver took after 100 years of handling and weather. It was small, maybe 3 inches across. It was heavy for its size. Lester had told Earl about the reel exactly once in 1982, sitting on the tailgate of Lester's truck at the Ausable Put-In on Route 86, with their waders half on and the morning mist still on the river. "I bought this rig at the Presbyterian rummage sale in '71, Lester had said. $2. The rod's nothing special, but the reel's something. It's made real well. The click on it. Listen." He had pulled line off the reel and let it run back, and the click had sung. Not the rough chatter of a cheap reel, but a smooth musical purr, the sound of precision. "I don't know who made it," Lester had said, "but whoever it was knew what he was doing." Earl had nodded. He had been 38. He had not thought about it again. Lester Dunham had been the kind of man who fished the way other men breathed, not for sport, not for trophies, but because the rivers were there, and he was there, and the arrangement suited both of them. He had fished the Ausable every Saturday from ice out to October for 40 years. He had caught thousands of brook trout. He had kept some. He had released most. He had used the same rod, released most. He had used the same rod and reel for 25 of those years, because it worked, and because Lester did not replace things that worked. He had cleaned the reel after every outing, a drop of oil on the spindle, a wipe with a soft rag, a click of the handle to make sure the drag was smooth. He had taken better care of the reel than of most things in his life, including his truck. The reel, in consequence, was in remarkable condition for a piece of tackle that had been fished hard for a quarter century. The click still sang. The drag was still silk. The German silver, though dark with patina, showed no pitting, no corrosion, no damage. The reel had been on the rod for as long as Earl had known the rod. Lester had never taken it off. He had never bought a second reel. He had never compared it to anything. He had clamped it onto the Montague the day he brought both home from the rummage sale and had never unclamped it. When Earl had asked him once, maybe 1990, whether he wanted a new reel, something from the Orvis catalog that came to the house every spring, Lester had looked at him and said, "Why would I want a new reel? This one works." And that had been the end of it. The irony, which Earl would not understand until much later, was that the Orvis catalog Lester had dismissed contained reels that were manufactured copies of the Vom Hofe design. Every modern click-and-pawl fly reel in America was, in some way, a descendant of the mechanism spinning quietly in Lester's hand on the Ausable every Saturday. Lester had been fishing with the original, while the rest of the world fished with the copies. Earl sat at the kitchen table that Wednesday morning with the rod and reel across his lap and the well driller's estimate on the table, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He carried the rod out to the truck and drove to town. The 2001 GMC Sierra had 219,000 miles and a rust hole in the rocker panel that had been there since the Bloomberg administration. Earl drove the 1.5 to Adirondack Pond on Lake Flower Avenue and parked at 9:10 on a cold gray April morning with ice still on the puddles. Adirondack Pond sat between a laundromat and a steward's shops. The bell jangled as Earl stepped inside. Sawyer was behind the counter on a laptop and looked up after about 7 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got an old fishing rod, my daddy's, with a reel. Was wondering, let's see it." Earl laid the rod and reel across the glass counter. Sawyer picked the rod up by the middle, not the grip, the middle, and bounced the tip twice. He squinted at the reel. He tapped the reel housing with his fingernail. The German silver rang. "Yeah, old fly rod, bamboo. We get these from estate sales mostly. Nobody fly fishes with bamboo anymore. The reels, I don't know, looks old. We can't sell old tackle unless it's a brand people know. This doesn't say anything on it I can read. 10 for the set." "The reel's well made. Handmade, I think. My daddy said—" "Sure, Pops." Sawyer leaned the rod against the side of the counter by the tip, letting the reel hang free. The rod bowed slightly under the reel's weight. $10. Take it or leave it." Earl's hands were flat on the counter. His jaw was set. He thought about the well pump. He thought about hauling jugs from the IGA. He thought about Marion in the living room with the oxygen tanks, and the way she'd looked at him one afternoon and said, "Earl, I can't even get a glass of water without this damn tube," and he'd brought her a glass and held it while she drank. He thought about Lester on the tailgate at the Ausable put-in, pulling line off the reel and listening to the click. I don't know who made it, but whoever it was knew what he was doing. He did not pick up the rod. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 22-year-old, and Earl Dunham had not cried in front of another human being since Marion's funeral in 2023. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in, mid-60s, lean, weathered, with a close-cropped gray beard and a full head of silver-white hair, and the kind of deep-set brown eyes that came from a lifetime of looking at moving water. He wore a dark green barber-waxed cotton jacket over a chamois shirt, olive canvas trousers, and brown leather lace-up wading boots that had been resoled twice. He carried a small brown leather satchel and a copy of the American Fly Fisher, the Journal of the American Museum of Fly Fishing, tucked under his arm. He came 2 steps inside, glanced at the counter, and stopped. He looked at the reel, not the rod. The reel. His eyes went straight to the small dark disc of German silver clamped to the bamboo rod leaning against the counter. He tilted his head 1 degree. He took another step. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet and deliberate, with the Vermont cadence of a man who had lived in the North Country long enough to have earned the accent. "Sir, is that a fly reel?" Sawyer looked up. "Old guy's selling. $10 for the set." The man did not look at Sawyer. He looked at Earl. "Sir, my name is Thomas Conklin. I am the curator of the American Museum of Fly Fishing in Manchester, Vermont. I have been the curator for 23 years. I am in Saranac Lake this week because we are cataloging a private collection of Adirondack Guide memorabilia donated by the family of a former Ausable guide. I stopped in here because I always stop in tackle shops and pawn shops. Would you permit me to examine that reel? Earl found his voice. You're asking me? It's yours, isn't it? It was my daddy's. Then yes, sir, I'm asking you. And I would ask you, please, to not let the rod lean on its tip with the reel hanging free. The weight of that reel on an unsupported tip will stress the bamboo. Sawyer straightened up and moved the rod to lie flat on the counter without being asked. Thomas Conklin set his satchel on the counter and opened it. He drew out a pair of thin white cotton handling gloves, a 10x jeweler's loop, a small LED pen light, a soft chamois, and a leather-bound notebook. He pulled the gloves on finger by finger. May I? Earl nodded. Thomas carefully unclamped the reel from the reel seat. The old hardware turned smoothly, which told him something before he even looked, and lifted the reel with both gloved hands. He set it on the chamois. He examined the side plate. He brought the loop to his eye. He studied the surface of the German silver, the patina, the texture, the hand-filing marks beneath the dark oxidation. He turned the reel over. He looked at the back plate. He looked at the foot, the flat bar at the bottom that clamped into the reel seat. He went still. Oh, he said, very quietly. He brought the loop and the pen light to the foot of the reel. He held the light at a grazing angle across the metal. He read something engraved there. Tiny letters, invisible without magnification, cut into the German silver with an engraving tool 140 years ago. He set the reel down on the chamois. He took off his gloves. He set them beside the reel. He picked them up. He put them back on. Mr. Dunham, Earl Dunham. Mr. Dunham, the foot of this reel is engraved with 3 characters and a number. The characters are JVH. The number is 427. He paused. Mr. Dunham, JVH is the maker's mark of Julius vom Hofe. Earl shook his head slightly. I don't know who that is, sir. Thomas Conklin nodded. He took a slow breath. Mr. Dunham, Julius vom Hofe was born in Germany in 1838 and emigrated to New York City in the 1850s. He and his brother Edward opened a fishing reel workshop on Fulton Street in Lower Manhattan. From the 1860s to approximately 1910, the vom Hofe brothers made what are considered, by unanimous agreement among collectors, historians, and museum curators, the finest fishing reels ever produced in the United States. Every reel was made by hand. Every reel was numbered. Every reel was built from German silver and hard rubber to tolerances that modern machine shops have difficulty matching. He picked the reel up again and turned it slowly in the light. The vom Hofe reels were the reels of the Gilded Age. They were used by the members of the great Adirondack fishing clubs, the Adirondack League Club, the Tahawus Club, the clubs that counted Morgans and Vanderbilts and Roosevelts among their members. They were used on the salmon rivers of New Brunswick and Quebec by men who chartered private railroad cars to reach the water. Every serious collector of American sporting antiques considers a vom Hofe reel the single most desirable object in the field. He turned the reel over and held the pen light at an angle across the side plate. Under the dark patina, barely visible, was a pattern, delicate floral scrollwork, hand-engraved with a burin, so fine that the lines looked like lace. This reel, Mr. Dunham, number 427, is a Julius vom Hofe multiplying salmon reel, approximately 1885. German silver frame and spool, hard rubber side plates. The dark color you see is not paint, it's ebonite, a vulcanized rubber that vom Hofe used as an insulating handle material so that cold water on the line wouldn't transfer to the angler's hand. The click mechanism is vom Hofe's patented spring and pawl design. The engraving on the side plates is hand-cut floral scrollwork, a vom Hofe signature. The drag is leather on metal, hand-fitted. And the condition, he paused. He pulled line off the reel slowly. The click sang, the same smooth musical purr, Lester had demonstrated on the tailgate in 1982. "The condition is extraordinary, Mr. Dunham. This reel has been fished hard for a long time, but it has been maintained, oiled, wiped, stored properly. The click is perfect. The drag is silk. The German silver has honest patina, but no pitting. Whoever fished this reel took care of it." "My daddy," Earl said. "He cleaned it after every trip. A drop of oil and a soft rag." Thomas Conklin nodded slowly. "Your father was a better conservator than most museum professionals, Mr. Dunham." The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. "At professional appraisal, with authentication from the American Museum of Fly Fishing and the vom Hofe registry maintained by the American Sporting Collectors Society, this reel would be valued between $45,000 and $65,000. Conservative estimate, $52,000. Sawyer's laptop was open and forgotten. His fingernail had stopped tapping. His mouth was slightly open. I was going to say 20. I meant 20. Earl didn't look at him. He was looking at the reel on the chamois and seeing his father's hands, the square, scarred, permanently bark-stained hands of a caretaker and a guide, holding that reel over the Ausable on a Saturday morning in 1983, the mist coming off the water, the brook trout rising in the shadow of the hemlock, and the click singing as the line went out. Lester had bought it for $2 at a rummage sale. He had fished with it for 25 years. He had not known it was made by the greatest reel maker in American history. He had known it was well made. He had known the click sang. He had known that whoever had built it knew what he was doing. That had been enough. Some men don't need to know the name. They know the craft by the feel of it in their hands. Thomas Conklin handed Earl his card. "Mr. Dunham, take your time. Talk to your son. But please, sir, do not leave this reel in this shop. And please, do not clamp it back onto that Montague rod. The reel deserves better mounting, and the rod is putting lateral stress on the foot." Earl nodded. He watched Thomas wrap the reel carefully in the chamois and hand it to him separately from the rod. Earl put the reel in the inside pocket of his jacket. He picked up the rod in his right hand. He nodded once at Thomas Conklin. He walked out past Sawyer without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the Sierra with the engine running and the heater on high and the April cold coming through the rust hole in the rocker panel, Earl Dunham held the chamois-wrapped reel against his chest and cried for the first time since Marion's funeral. He called Lester Jr. that night. Lester Jr. drove down from Plattsburgh the next morning. They sat at the kitchen table on Pine Street with the reel on the chamois between them, and Earl told him the whole story. Lester Jr., who had been named for a grandfather he remembered as a quiet man in canvas waders who always smelled like river, held the reel in both hands and pulled the line and listened to the click and said, "That's the sound, Dad. That's the sound from the truck. I remember." "I know you do," Earl said. They called Thomas Conklin at 9. The American Museum of Fly Fishing sent a conservator to Saranac Lake in May. The reel was authenticated against the vom Hofe registry, number 427, production date estimated 1884 to 1886. Original purchaser unknown but consistent with Adirondack Club provenance based on the salmon reel size and the multiplication ratio. The German silver was tested. The ebonite was confirmed. The hand-engraved scrollwork was photographed under magnification and matched to other documented Julius vom Hofe engravings. Authentication was unanimous. The museum acquired the reel for permanent display through a 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Dunham family $48,000. The reel went on display in the museum's Gilded Age Gallery in Manchester, Vermont in September, beside a display of Adirondack guide photographs from the 1880s and a cutaway diagram of the vom Hofe click mechanism and a placard, Julius vom Hofe, multiplying salmon reel, number 427, circa 1885. German silver and hard rubber. Hand-engraved floral scrollwork. Vom Hofe Workshop, Fulton Street, New York. Purchased at a church rummage sale in Saranac Lake, New York in 1971 for $2 by Lester Dunham, 1922 to 1996. Adirondack caretaker and fishing guide. fished by Dunham on the Ausable, Saranac, and Riquette rivers for 25 years, on loan from the family of Earl L. Dunham, Saranac Lake, New York. Lester Jr. drove his father to Manchester for the dedication. Earl wore the dark suit he'd worn to Marion's funeral. He stood in front of the case for a long time, looking at the reel under the museum lights, the same reel his father had cleaned with a drop of oil and a soft rag after every Saturday on the Ausable. "You knew, didn't you, Daddy?" Earl said, quiet enough that only Lester Jr. heard him. "You didn't know the name, but you knew the hands. He paid for the well pump. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He sent Lester Jr. $15,000 and told him to put it toward the nursing tuition and not to argue. He set up a small trust for his 2 grandchildren. He had the truck's rocker panel patched, not replaced, patched, because Earl Dunham did not replace things that still worked. He bought Marion a new headstone with her full name and a line beneath that read, 'Wife, Mother.' She waited while I fished." A letter came to Earl's post office box in November. It was from a 92-year-old man in Manchester, Vermont, named Walter Bostwick, whose grandfather had been a member of the Ausable Club in the 1890s. Walter had seen the reel at the museum. He wrote that his grandfather's journals, preserved in the club's archive, mentioned a Julius von Hofer reel, number 427, purchased in 1886 from the Fulton Street workshop for $35. The journal entry read, "Bought a new reel from von Hof today, number 427. The click on it sounds like a church bell underwater. I shall use it on the East Branch this Saturday." Walter wrote that the reel had been listed as sold or dispersed in the club's 1920 inventory. It had been missing for 101 years. Now it was home. 2 miles from the river it had been built for. Earl read the letter twice. He put it in the chamois with the card Thomas Conklin had given him, and the next Saturday morning, back home in Saranac Lake, Earl sat down at his usual booth at the Tail of the Pup restaurant on Main Street with his 2 oldest friends, Bob LaFountain and Jerry Dussault, the way he had every Saturday for 24 years. Bob looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the Adirondack Daily, Earl." "Heard that. Fishing reel, huh?" "Fishing reel." Jerry shook his head. $10. $10, Earl agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that reel and said $10. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.